My name is Grace, and for 25 years I believed I had the kind of marriage that would last forever. I met Daniel when I was just 22, working part-time at a small library in Portland. He used to come in every Friday just before closing, pretending to browse books, but really just to see me. He was charming, funny, and had this quiet confidence that made me feel safe. We fell in love slowly, the kind of love that feels simple, like breathing. We built our life piece by piece, a small rented apartment at first, then our first little house on the edge of town. We had our share of struggles, bills that never seemed to end, broken cars, long nights rocking our baby to sleep, but through it all we laughed, we made promises under cheap Christmas lights, and believed love could conquer anything. When our kids were small, Daniel worked long hours as a mechanic, while I taught part-time at the community school. We never had much, but we had enough. We cooked together on weekends, watched old movies and danced. Dee in the kitchen with the radio playing soft country tunes, the kind of simple happiness that makes you think you're untouchable. But time has a way of testing even the strongest bonds. The kids grew up, left for college, and the house that once felt too small suddenly felt too big. The laughter faded into quiet routines. We still talked, but the conversations were shorter. He was always tired. I was always busy trying to fill the silence with work or friends. I didn't notice the distance building between us until one day it felt like a wall. It started subtly. He began spending more time on his phone, taking long drives alone, coming home later than usual. When I asked, he would smile and say, "Just needed some air, Grace, you worry too much." And I believed him because for 25 years he had never given me a reason not to. One evening we sat at the dinner table in that same old house. The air felt heavy, like it was holding its breath. He pushed his plate aside, looked at me and said, "Grace, there's some thing I need to tell you." My heart started to race. Before he even said the words, he looked tired, older. Somehow he said, "I don't know how to say this, but I think I need something different, something new." My throat went dry. I asked, "What do you mean different?" He looked away and said, "I met someone, she's younger. It's not serious yet, but I need to be honest with you." For a long moment I couldn't breathe. The clock on the wall kept ticking, but everything else stopped. The man who once promised to grow old with me now wanted someone younger, prettier, livelier. Maybe my chest ached as if the air itself turned to glass. I whispered, "After 25 years, Daniel, you want to start over?" He didn't answer right away, then said, "I didn't plan this, Grace, but I can't ignore how I feel." I stood up from the table, walked to the sink, and stared at the window. The reflection staring back at me looked tired, lines near my eyes, hair turning gray. I thought of every meal cooked, every night waited up for him, every prayer. "Whoa," whispered when he was late. I turned around slowly and said, "You think love is something that expires like milk. You think youth can replace history." He said, "It's not like that, Grace. I just don't want to feel trapped. I need to find myself again." His words cut through me like cold wind. I wanted to scream, but instead I whispered, "You already found yourself, Daniel. You found me, and you forgot what that means." He looked ashamed for a second, then said, "I'll stay with my brother for a while to give us both space," and just like that he left. That night the house felt different. Every sound echoed louder, the refrigerator, the ticking clock, even my own heartbeat. I sat in the dark holding a cup of cold coffee and wondered how a love built over decades could vanish in a single conversation. But somewhere deep inside, a small voice whispered, "You will survive, Grace. You always have. You were strong before him, and you will be strong after him." I didn't know it then, but that night was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of finding myself again. The woman I had once been before life made me small. The first few weeks after Daniel left felt like walking through a fog. I woke up every morning expecting to hear his footsteps or the sound of the coffee maker, but the house stayed silent. I would set 2 plates out for breakfast without thinking, then quietly put one back. The small routines of marriage stayed behind like ghosts, and every corner of that house reminded me of what I had lost. The neighbors tried to help in their kind small ways. Mrs. Henderson from next door brought casseroles, said she was sorry, and reminded me to eat my sister cold every evening just to ask how I was doing. I always said I'm fine. Even though I wasn't, my heart ached in a way that words couldn't hold. The silence after a 25-year marriage is heavy. It hums in the air like an echo that refuses to fade. At night, I sat on the porch wrapped in a blanket, listening to the wind rustle through the trees, and wondered where he... Was he with her? Was he thinking of me? Did he ever feel the emptiness I did? Sometimes I told myself I didn't care, but then a memory would slip in like the scent of rain, and it hurt all over again. A month later, I found myself cleaning out the closet, not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't stand the smell of his shirts anymore. I folded them carefully one by one and placed them in a box. I stopped at a blue flannel he used to wear when we went camping. I pressed it to my face and whispered, "Why wasn't I enough?" The tears came quietly, soft, steady, and unstoppable. I sat there for a long time until my chest felt empty. Then something shifted. Maybe it was exhaustion, or maybe it was that small voice inside me again, the one that refused to die. It said, "Grace, you have spent your whole life taking care of everyone else. Maybe it's time to take care of you." The next morning, I went for a walk. The air was cool and the sun just beginning to rise. I walked past the bakery, the park, the coffee shop we used to go to. I expected the sadness to swallow me, but instead I felt something new, small but real freedom. It felt strange at first, almost guilty, but it was there. I started making little changes. I painted the living room a soft yellow. I planted flowers in the garden, something I'd always wanted to do, but Daniel never liked. I signed up for a pottery class at the community center. The first day I felt awkward sitting among strangers with clay on my hands, but when the teacher smiled and said, "There's no wrong way to shape something," I felt something unlock inside me. That night, I came home with my first crooked clay bowl and laughed for the first time in months. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. Every fingerprint, every uneven edge was part of me. And it reminded me that broken things can still become beautiful. Days turned into weeks, and slowly I began to rediscover who Grace was without Daniel. I read more books, took long drives to the coast, visited my sister in Seattle. I learned to cook Jew. Tea for me and light candles at dinner, because I deserved beauty even when I was alone. Then one afternoon, as I was walking out of the grocery store, I saw him. He was standing by his truck, looking older, more tired than I remembered. He smiled awkwardly and said, "Hi, Grace, it's been a while." I nodded and said, "Yes, it has." He asked, "How are you doing?" I looked him in the eyes and said, "I'm learning to be happy again." His face softened as if he didn't expect that answer. He said, "I'm glad to hear that, Grace. Really, I am." We talked for a few minutes, polite, careful. He mentioned he was staying with his brother. Still, things hadn't worked out with the woman. I felt no anger, just a quiet sadness, a distant echo of something that used to be. He said, "You look different, happier." I smiled and said, "Maybe I finally remembered who I am." When I got home, I sat in the garden, watching the sunlight fall over the flowers, and I realized something powerful. I didn't need his apology or his return. I didn't even need closure. What I needed was myself, and I had found her again. That night, as the stars came out, I whispered, "Thank you, life, for breaking me, because now I know I can heal." Spring arrived quietly that year, bringing color back into my world. The garden that I had planted began to bloom, bright tulips, soft daisies, and roses in every shade. I would wake early each morning, open the windows, and let the scent of new beginnings fill the house. It felt good to care for something again, even if it was just flowers. They didn't ask for anything except light and patience, and maybe that was what I needed too. One Saturday, the community center hosted an art fair, and my pottery teacher convinced me to join. She said, "Grace, your bowls are beautiful. Bring a few and just see what happens." I laughed and said, "Who would buy my crooked little bowls?" But she insisted, so I went. I set up a small table with 4 pieces and a handwritten sign that said, "Made with heart." People walked by smiling, politely touching the edges of the bowls, saying how warm they felt. A young woman bought one for her mother and said, "This feels like it was made with love." I smiled and said it was later that day. A man stopped at my table. He looked to be in his early 50s, tall, kind eyes, gray at the temples. He picked up one of my bowls, turned it over, and said, This one's got character, I said. That's because it's imperfect like life. He chuckled and said, then it's perfect for me. He introduced himself as Jack. He told me he ran a small coffee shop in town and was looking for local artists to feature handmade cups and bowls on display. I said, mine aren't exactly professional. He said, that's the point. They're real, just like people should be. We talked for a while, and something about his calm, easy way felt safe. A week later, I visited his coffee shop. It was small but full of warmth. The walls were covered with local art. The air smelled like cinnamon and roasted beans. He greeted every customer by name. I watched him work, moving gently as if he respected every soul. Who walked through his door when he saw me, he smiled the same soft smile from the fair. He said, Grace, I'm glad you came. He showed me a little shelf near the counter and said, I saved this space for your bowls if you still want to share them. I hesitated for a moment, then nodded. We placed them carefully side by side, and he said, you see that they fit right in. I looked at the shelf, and for the first time in a long time felt proud of something I had done for myself. Over the next few weeks, I visited often, sometimes to drop off new pottery, sometimes just to sit by the window with coffee and watch the rain. Jack and I talked easily about everything and nothing. He told me about his late wife, how she had loved painting, how he still kept her brushes by the window. I told him about Daniel, how I had lost and found myself again. He listened without judgment, no pity, just understanding. One rainy afternoon, as we sat by the window, he said, Grace, I think life gives us second chances, not to erase the past, but to remind us that we can start again, even after everything. I looked at him and said, maybe you're right. Maybe second chances aren't about people. Maybe they're about peace. He nodded and said, maybe they're the same thing. That night, I drove home thinking about his words. The rain tapped softly on the windshield, and for the first time, I didn't feel lonely. I felt alive, the kind of alive that comes when your heart begins to trust again, not in others, but in yourself. As summer came, the coffee shop became my favorite place in town. I helped Jack set up an art corner for local women to sell crafts and pottery. Soon it became more than a shop. It was a small circle of people healing through creativity and community. Sometimes I caught Jack looking at me with quiet affection, but he never said anything and I didn't push it. It felt enough just to feel seen again. One evening as we were closing, he said, Grace, you've brought light into this place. I looked around at the glowing lamps, the laughter of woe, men packing up their art, and said, maybe I just found mine and shared it. He smiled gently and said, either way, it's beautiful. That night, when I returned home, I sat on the porch with tea in my hands, watching the stars, and I thought about how far I had come. The pain that once felt unbearable had become a doorway to strength. I realized I no longer measured my worth by who stayed or who left. I measured it by how deeply I could love still, even after being broken. I whispered to the night, thank you for every ending, because it led me here, and for the first time in years, my heart didn't ache. It glowed. The days passed gently that summer, and I began to feel at peace in a way I hadn't known for years. The garden outside my window bloomed brighter than ever, the flowers standing tall, as if they too had found their courage each morning. I watered them while humming old songs, and sometimes I caught myself smiling without even realizing it. It felt like I was finally living, not just surviving. Jack became a quiet part of my life. He never pushed, never hurried anything. He simply showed up with kindness. We often met at his coffee shop. After closing hours, he would brew a fresh pot just for the two of us. And we would sit by the window talking about simple things like music or family, or the way life surprises you when you least expect it. One evening, as the sun began to set, he said softly, Grace, I see so much strength in you. I wish you knew how bright you shine. I laughed a little and said, strength doesn't feel bright, Jack, it feels heavy. He looked at me for a long moment and said, maybe it's both. Maybe the heaviest things are the ones that make us glow the most. Something in his words stayed with me for days. I realized he was right. Strength isn't loud. It doesn't roar. Sometimes it's just a quiet decision to keep going when everything in you wants to stop. A few weeks later, my son David came to visit. He had moved to another state years ago and hadn't been home since the divorce. He hugged me tight. Lee, when he arrived and said, "Mom, you look different, happier," I smiled and said, "I'm learning to be." He sat with me in the garden and asked about Dad. I hesitated, then told him the truth that Daniel had made his choices and I had made mine. David nodded quietly and said, "I used to be angry at him, but I think I understand now. Sometimes people lose themselves before they even know it." I told him that's true, but we don't have to lose ourselves with them. We spent the evening cooking dinner together, laughing like old times, and for the first time since the family broke apart, it felt whole again. Later that night, after he went to bed, I sat by the window thinking about how pain can change shape. When you stop fighting it, it becomes softer, lighter, almost like a scar that doesn't hurt anymore but still tells a story. A few days later, I got a call from the hospital. Daniel had been in an accident, nothing life-threatening but serious enough to need help. I hesitated before going, my heart heavy with old wounds. But I went anyway. When I entered the room, he looked older, weaker, his eyes full of regret. He said softly, "Grace, I didn't know who I was without you. I was foolish." She nodded quietly and said, "Maybe we both had to lose something to learn what really matters." He reached for my hand and whispered, "I'm sorry for the way I left. I'm sorry for the years I wasted." I said, "Daniel, we can't change the past, but we can forgive it." He closed his eyes and said, "I don't deserve that." I said, "Maybe not, but forgiveness isn't about deserving. It's about letting go." When I left the hospital that day, I didn't feel bitter or broken. I felt free, the kind of freedom that comes when you finally stop carrying what isn't yours anymore. I drove straight to the coffee shop where Jack was closing. He saw my face and said, "Everything okay?" I said, "Yes, everything's okay now. I think I just closed a chapter of my life." He poured me a cup of tea and said, "Then here's to new beginnings, Grace." We sat there in silence, the sound of rain tapping on the windows. The shop smelled like coffee and cinnamon, and for a moment, everything felt right. I realized then that sometimes courage isn't about standing up to others. It's about standing up for yourself, choosing peace, choosing hope, choosing to begin again. Weeks turned into months. The art display at the coffee shop grew. Women from all over town came to share their creations. I started teaching pottery on weekends, guiding others through the same healing that had helped me. Jack was always there, quietly supporting, never taking over, just holding space for everyone. It was the kind of love that didn't need words, just presence. One evening as I was cleaning up, he said, "You know, Grace, when I met you, I thought you were strong, but now I see you're brave too." I looked at him and said, "Maybe bravery just means showing up for your own life, even after it's fallen apart." He smiled and said, "Then you're the bravest woman I know." That night I stood outside under the stars, feeling the soft wind brush a guy. I nursed my face and I thought about how life had taken everything from me once, yet here I was whole again. It wasn't the life I planned, but maybe it was the life I was meant to live. Autumn came quietly that year, the air turning crisp and golden, leaves swirling around the small town like little notes from heaven. I loved that time of year. The world felt softer, more thoughtful. I spent my mornings in the garden, brushing fallen leaves from the flowers, and my afternoons at the coffee shop, helping Jack with the new displays. The place had grown busier. People seemed drawn not just to the coffee, but to the calm warmth that filled every corner. Jack had become more than a friend, though neither of us had said it out loud. Yet there was a tenderness between us that didn't need naming. He'd bring me small things like an old book he thought I'd love, or a cinnamon roll fresh from the oven, and I'd leave little notes for him on the counter, simple. Things like "Thank you for the light," or "You make people feel safe." One evening, we hosted a small community dinner to celebrate the artists who shared their work at the shop. The place was glowing with soft lights, laughter and music. I watched as people shared stories, hugged, cried. Even it struck me then that kindness creates ripples that reach places we can't even see. Later that night, after everyone had gone, Jack and I stayed behind to clean up. The lights were dim and the air smelled like coffee and rain. He said softly, "You know, Grace, you've turned this place into something special." I smiled and said, "Maybe we both did." He looked at me for a long moment, then reached for my hand. It felt natural, easy, like it was meant to happen. We didn't speak for a while, just stood there, hand in hand, watching the rain outside. Then he said, "You've healed a lot of hearts, including mine." I whispered, "Maybe that's what we were both meant to do, heal each other." He smiled gently and said, "Then let's keep doing that." In the weeks that followed, we grew closer. We spent weekends driving to nearby towns, visiting antique shops or walking by the lake, sometimes talking, sometimes just sitting in silence. I realized that peace doesn't always come with excitement. Sometimes it comes with quiet moments when your heart finally feels at home. But life has its way of testing you just when you think everything has settled. One afternoon, I got a call from the hospital again, this time about Jack. He had collapsed at the shop, a mild heart attack. They said he would recover, but he needed rest. I remember sitting by his hospital bed, his hand in mine, whispering, "You're not allowed to leave just yet." He opened his eyes and smiled weakly and said, "Don't worry, I'm not going anywhere. I have too much coffee to make and too many bowls to display." That small moment reminded me how fragile life is, how love isn't about how long it lasts, but how deeply it's felt. I spent every day by his side until he came home, helping him with small things, making soup, reading to him in the evenings. He would joke that I'd the hospital food jealous, and I'd laugh, but inside I prayed for his strength. When he finally returned to the coffee shop, the whole community came to welcome him back. The walls were filled with new artwork, and there was a banner that said, "We missed you, Jack." He looked at me, tears shining in his eyes, and said, "You did this, didn't you?" I said, "Maybe, but they all wanted to show you how loved you are." He whispered, "I've never felt this kind of love before, not even when I was younger." I smiled and said, "Maybe because this time it's real, the kind that grows after pain, not before it." That night, after everyone left, we sat together in the quiet shop, the lights low, the smell of cinnamon and fresh coffee lingering. He took my hand and said, "Grace, when I met you, I thought life was almost over, but now I see it's just beginning." I said, "Maybe that's the secret, Jack. Life begins again every time we choose to love despite the pain." We stayed there for a long time, holding hands, saying nothing because words were needed. The silence between us wasn't empty anymore. It was full of peace, full of everything we had both lost and found again. That night when I got home, I looked at my reflection in the window, the soft lines on my face, the gentle smile that had returned, and I thought of everything that had happened, the heartbreak, the loneliness, the healing, and the love that grew from it all. I whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on me, even when I wanted to give up on myself." The next morning, the sun rose golden and warm over the town. I walked into the garden, barefoot, dew sparkling on the grass, and I felt something deep in my chest, something steady and alive. It was gratitude, not for the pain, but for the strength it gave me, for the way it led me to the person I had become. Winter came sooner than expected that year. The mornings were colder, and the air carried that quiet stillness that only snow can bring. I would wake early, make a cup of tea, and sit by the window watching the first light of dawn touch the trees. Jack's recovery had been steady but slow. He was learning to take things easier, though patience wasn't always his strength. I visited him every day, bringing warm soup and little bits of laughter just to keep his spirit light. One morning he looked at me across the table and said, "Grace, do you ever think about how different life turned out from what we planned?" I smiled softly and said, "Every day, but maybe that's what makes it beautiful." He nodded and said, "I used to think love only belonged to the young, but now I know it belongs to anyone brave enough to keep believing in it." His words stayed with me all day as I walked home. The snow crunched softly under my boots, and I realized how true they were. Love after loss feels quieter but deeper, like roots that grow stronger underground. It doesn't ask for attention, it just holds you steady when life tries to shake you. A few weeks later, David came home for the holidays. He brought his wife and their little daughter Emily, my first grandchild. She had bright eyes and the kind of laughter that made every room feel lighter. Watching her run around the living room made me think about how time keeps moving forward, no matter what it takes or gives. David hugged me one night and said, "Mom, I'm proud of you. You built a whole new life after everything. I don't think I could have done that." I smiled and said, "You'll be surprised what you can do when life leaves you no other choice." Christmas that year was simple but full of warmth. We cooked together, shared stories, and laughed like we hadn't in years. Jack joined us for dinner, sitting quietly beside me, holding Emily on his lap. She looked at him and said, "Grandpa." Jack and everyone laughed. He blushed a little but smiled wide and said, "I'll take that title gladly." I looked at him across the table and felt my heart swell, not with the wild love of youth, but with the deep, calm love that grows when you've been through storms together. But as the new year began, life brought another challenge. Jack's docked or called one afternoon asking me to come in. He explained that Jack's heart had weakened again, that he needed surgery, this time more serious. I felt my chest tighten the way it had years ago when Daniel left, but this pain was different. It wasn't fear of being abandoned. It was fear of losing someone I had learned to love again after thinking I never would. That night I sat by Jack's bed holding his hand. He looked tired but peaceful. He said softly, "Grace, don't be afraid whatever happens. I want you to know I've had more joy in these years with you than I ever thought possible." I tried to smile, but my eyes filled with tears. I whispered, "You're not leaving yet. We still have coffee to make and bowls to fill." He squeezed my hand and said, "You've always been the brave one." The day of the surgery, the sky was gray and heavy with snow. I waited in the hospital lobby, hands wrapped around the cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The hours passed slowly, each minute stretching like a lifetime, when the doctor finally came out and said he made it through. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The recovery was hard, but he made it, and every day after that felt like a gift. We promised each other that we would never waste a single sunrise again. We took drives along the coast, visited old bookstores, and spent evenings listening to soft music by the fire. Sometimes we didn't even talk, we just sat together, grateful to still be here, still breathing, still loving. One evening, as the snow fell outside, he said, "Grace, do you ever regret giving love another chance?" I looked at him and said, "Never, not for a single second. Because even if love doesn't last forever, it teaches us to live fully while it does." He smiled and said, "That's exactly what you've done. You've taught me how to live again." That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about how strange and beautiful life was. 25 years of marriage had ended in heartbreak, yet here I was, years later, finding peace in places I never imagined love hadn't. Saved me. I had saved myself, but love had helped me remember who I was. As the snow fell softly outside my window, I whispered to the quiet night, "Thank you for every ending that became a beginning and for giving me the courage to love again." Spring came early that year, bringing sunlight that melted away the last of winter's cold. The flowers in my garden began to bloom again, bright and full of life, and every morning I'd walk outside just to breathe it all in. Jack had recovered enough to start coming to the shop again, though he moved slower, now more careful with each step. Still, his smile never faded. He said, "One morning, Grace, I think every sunrise after a storm feels brighter." I said, "That's because we know how dark it can be." Life settled into a rhythm, quiet but full. We opened the coffee shop together. Every day he would grind the beans while I arranged flowers on the tables. It wasn't grand or exciting, but it was peaceful, and that peace felt like a miracle after all we had been through. Tim. The younger couples who came in would watch us and smile. One of them once said, "You two are what love should look like." I laughed softly and said, "Love just looks like showing up every day, no matter how hard it gets." One afternoon we closed early and drove to the lake. The water shimmered under the late sun, and the air smelled like pine trees. Jack brought a small picnic basket with sandwiches and a thermos of coffee. We sat on the old wooden bench watching the ripples move across the water. He said, "You know, Grace, I used to think happiness was something you chase, but I think it's something you grow." I nodded and said, "Maybe it's both. Maybe it starts when you stop chasing it." He leaned back, eyes half closed, and said, "When I first met you, I thought you were the strongest person I'd ever seen. But now I know strength isn't what you show, it's what you carry quietly." I looked at him and said, "Maybe that's what love is too. Something we carry quietly, but always." The sky turned soft shades of orange, deep pink, As the sun began to set, I rested my head on his shoulder, and for a long time neither of us spoke. There was no need for words. The silence was full of understanding, full of everything we had survived and everything we had learned. That summer, we decided to take a trip, a small road journey. Just the two of us, we visited little towns along the coast, stayed at small inns, and collected memories like seashells. Each place had its own story, and we added ours to it. We met people who reminded us that kindness is still everywhere. We laughed more than we had in years, sometimes over silly things like getting lost or spilling coffee on the dashboard. But life, as always, has a way of reminding us that nothing lasts forever. One evening after returning home, Jack began to feel weak again. He brushed it off, said he was just tired, but I saw the truth in his eyes. He was fading. The doctor said his heart was failing slowly this time and that there wasn't much they could do. I held his hand tightly and spared. We'll take this one day at a time. He smiled and said, that's all we've ever done. And look how far we made it. Over the next few months, I cared for him at home. We spent our evenings listening to old records and talking about life, sometimes laughing, sometimes just holding hands. He told me once, Grace, if I don't wake up one morning, promise me you'll keep living, not just breathing, but living. I tried to keep my voice steady and said, I promise, but you'll be here a long time. Yet he smiled and said, maybe, but promises like that matter more than time. The night before he passed, he asked me to sit beside him on the porch. The stars were bright, the air cool, and still he said, do you know what I'm most grateful for? I said what he whispered, that I found love twice in one lifetime and that both times it was real. I felt tears run down my face, but I smiled through them and said, and I'm grateful that you reminded me love can begin again even after everything breaks. The next morning I woke to sunlight, tea streaming through the window and the stillness that told me he was gone. He looked peaceful, almost as if he had just fallen asleep. I held his hand, kissed his forehead and whispered, you kept your promise, Jack. You made every day matter. The days after were quiet, but not empty. I felt his presence in the coffee shop, in the laughter of the people we had brought together, in the flowers blooming outside my window. He was gone, but not really. Every part of my life still carried him. One evening I sat in the shop alone. After closing the lights low, the room filled with that familiar scent of coffee and warmth, I whispered, thank you for loving me when I didn't know I could be loved again, and for teaching me that endings can be beautiful. 2 years passed quietly after Jack's passing. The seasons kept changing, and so did I. The coffee shop still stood at the corner of Maple Street, its wooden sign slightly faded but full of memory. People still came every morning for their favorite brew, and I still stood behind the counter, greeting them with a smile. Sometimes new customers would ask who started this place, and I would say softly, a man who believed that kindness could change a town, and they would smile, not knowing that he changed me most of all. The garden behind my house grew wilder, but in a beautiful way. Every flower seemed to tell a story. The roses that bloomed again after the storm, the daisies that grew from soil I once thought too dry. I often sat there in the evenings with a cup of tea, watching the light fade over the petals, thinking about how love never really leaves. It just changes shape. It becomes the warmth in a quiet room, the laughter of strangers, the courage to open your heart again. David visited often, bringing Emily, who was growing so fast. She reminded me of sunlight, bright, untamed, and full of life. One afternoon, she ran up to me, holding a wild flower she had picked from the edge of the garden. She said, Grandma, do flowers get tired of growing? I smiled and said, maybe sometimes. But they keep growing anyway because that's what they were made to do. She nodded seriously, then said, just like you, right, Grandma? I laughed softly and said, yes, just like me. That night, after everyone had gone home, I sat by the window, the same one where I had once cried. After Daniel left, the same one where I had watched the first snowfall alone so many years ago, only this time I felt no emptiness. The room was filled with quiet peace. I thought about my life, about the woman I had been and the one I had become. I remembered the heartbreak, the tears, the loneliness, and then the courage, the healing, and the love that had found me when I least expected it. I realized that life doesn't take things from us to punish us. It does it to prepare us to make room for what's meant to come for a long time. I believed my story had ended the day my husband walked away. But I see now that it was only the beginning. Sometimes endings are really invitations to start again. I started writing letters to myself, little notes that I kept in a jar on the kitchen shelf. Each one began the same way. Dear Grace, thank you for not giving up. Some days the letters were short, a single line, like you are stronger than you think. Other days they were long pages full of gratitude for the life I had lived, for the love I had known, for the lessons I had learned. I never showed them to anyone. They were just for me, my quiet reminder that bravery can look like simply waking up and choosing joy. Years later, the shop became a community landmark. People called it Grace's Corner. It made me smile every time I heard it. I never planned to become a symbol of strength or healing, but maybe that's how life works. Sometimes you live through something and without meaning to you, become a light for someone else. On the anniversary of Jack's passing, I closed the shop early and drove to the lake where we had once sat together, watching the sunset. The same bench still stood there, the same trees, the same calm, rippling water. I sat down with a all thermos of coffee and whispered, "You'd laugh if you saw me now, Jack, running a whole shop by myself. He'd probably say, 'I told you you could do anything.' And I'd smile and answer yes, but only because you believed in me first." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, I felt the wind move gently through my hair, and for a moment I could almost hear his voice, soft and steady, saying, "Grace, you did it. You lived fully. You loved bravely. You healed." I closed my eyes and whispered, "Thank you for finding me when I was lost and for showing me how to find myself again." I stayed there until the stars appeared, their light reflecting off the water like tiny promises. I thought about everyone who might hear my story one day, and I hoped they would understand this simple truth, that it's never too late to begin again, no matter how broken you feel, that love doesn't end when people leave. It lives in the courage to keep your heart open, that forgiveness is not weakness, it's freedom. When I finally stood to leave, I looked back one last time at the lake, glowing in the moonlight, and said softly, "Goodbye, my love, and thank you for every ordinary day that turned into something extraordinary because we chose to love through the pain." I drove home that night with the windows slightly open, the cool air brushing my face. I felt peace, not the kind that comes from everything being perfect, but the kind that comes from knowing you made it through and found meaning in the mess of it all. I walked into my house, the scent of flowers drifting from the garden, and whispered to the quiet room, "I'm still here and I'm still growing." And maybe that was the real ending, not the heartbreak or even the new love, but the moment I realized that being brave doesn't mean never falling apart. It means you learn to gather the pieces and make something beautiful out of them every single time. The end.